Great. How many of you, geez Louise. I appreciate the patience, everyone, truly.
And usually we do not have a problem, but we thought you would initiate a test to see how your hand will perform.
Well, hopefully I passed that test. So.
You did amazing.
Great.
Sorry about that, Elyse.
Yeah, no, you're good. So how many of you have already used some kind of scholarship to address a real world need? Small handful. Okay, so that's really, really helpful. Hopefully that means that we're gonna have an interesting and robust conversation, and hopefully it means that there are multiple avenues that folks in the audience can use to connect with some of the things that I'd like to share with you today. So before I get started, I'd actually like to introduce myself in the context of where I come from. No? Yeah, can we try the other clicker maybe?
Yeah, we can use the clicker.
So I'd like to introduce myself in the context of where I come from, because it will shape, I think, a little bit of what I have to say. So unlike many of you in the room, I am not a science communication theorist. I don't actually have a PhD in communication. My PhD is in neuroscience. I came at this very much from the lens of a practitioner. And ever since I was in high school and was the target of science engagement and outreach efforts, I've been involved and have had an engagement practice in addition to my scholarship. And over time, that became a bigger and bigger part of my life. During grad school in the early 2010s, I was part of the rising so-called grad SciComm movement and was one of those people who launched an organization and started developing trainings, so peer-based training models, all of that. I ended up eventually, after doing a lot of consulting work, landing a role at a university-wide level. So in 2018, I got hired into a then very new presidential strategic area of focus to support faculty public engagement. But here's the twist. It was outside of my comfort zone. I had been swimming in the science communication space, and suddenly I was in an environment where I was responsible not just for STEM and medicine, but also for social sciences, humanities, and the arts and design. And so a lot of what I'm sharing today are the types of things that I wish I had known when I was entering into that space. And so I hope that that frame, thank you so much, Julia. Hope that that frame can help anchor us today.
Do you want me to cue your slides?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind. Okay, thank you. Okay, so my team now is situated in the Office of the Vice President for Research. We support all three campuses, the flagship campus in Ann Arbor, as well as our sister important regional campuses in Dearborn and Flint. I will note that with regards to community engagement and public engagement, Dearborn and Flint are actually the leaders ahead of Ann Arbor. They're both community engaged campuses according to the Carnegie classification. Ann Arbor is not. Interesting fact. Yep. My team, next, thank you, Juliet. My team does support the entire breadth of academic disciplines. And we self-describe as situating ourselves squarely at the intersection between research and practice. And what I mean by that for this purpose is that our job is to serve faculty and researchers at the University of Michigan. And we do that in part by synthesizing the literature around different forms of engagement in order to address practitioner problems in our space. And we translate that into tools, resources, activities, opportunities, facilitated experiences that help to address those different types of challenges. So hopefully that gives you an introduction. My goal today is to try and give you a few different avenues and to reflect on the experiences that I've had in these different roles that really helps to frame the way that I think about the different pathways to translate scholarship to practice. The takeaway that I want you to leave with today is that there's no one right way of doing it. There's no one right way of doing it. There are multiple avenues, which is great. There are multiple avenues, which means that there are different strengths and assets that you can bring to the table. And it also means that, especially for those trainees in the room, you have the opportunity to really lean in and to practice some of the skills and competencies that are important for these things during your training so that you're well equipped to be able to translate your scholarship into practice. Next slide. Thank you so much, Julia. So out of curiosity, who here has heard of Ernest Boyer? I appreciate you, Sarah. You're one of the few people because we talked last night. So Ernest Boyer is an interesting guy. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. He was a scholar of higher education and was the president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, especially in the 80s and the 90s. And in 1990, he published a treatise that argued for a reflective history of higher education called Scholarship Reimagined. And in that, he pointed to the evolution of higher education moving from a teaching and service focus, primarily after World War II, increasingly to a research focus in the modern world. And in that, he framed 4, arguably 5, different mechanisms or different types of scholarship. Number 1, the scholarship of discovery. My bet is that the vast majority of the people in this room are scholars of discovery. So what I'm talking about with scholarship of discovery is original research. Who here is pursuing original research? Yeah, that's my bet. Number 2, the scholarship of integration. The scholarship of integration is less about asking new, novel research questions and more about pulling threads from different disciplines and different ways of knowing and engaging with different types of topics in order to address questions by means of sense-making. Number 3, the scholarship of application. The scholarship of application is around the translation, the active translation of a research result into a real-world impact. And interestingly, I find this actually fascinating as an institutional change wonk. Ernest Boyer agreed that we're not just talking about real-world impacts, we're also talking about changes to the academy. So when I talk about myself as a research practitioner, that's another one of the places where I situate myself. Finally, he talks about the scholarship of teaching. And importantly, he's talking not just about the scholarship of teaching of the work of universities and the type of education that you all are pursuing. He's also talking about the ways that universities create opportunities to educate broadly in society, the translation of ideas, translation and communication of ideas. Finally, there is an idea in a publication that emerged after he died in 1996 called the Scholarship of Engagement, which really argues for a synthesis of those 4 areas and calls for different types of institutional change. Next slide. So I'm going to have you read this because it really synthesizes what I mean by the Scholarship of Engagement. You're all going to read it faster than I could read it to you anyway. So note that when he's talking about the scholarship of engagement, he's talking about 2 things. And both of these things are going to be themes through the rest of my talk. It's about the mission of connecting research to real-world problems, and it's also about creating the culture within institutions of higher education that enable that to happen. Okay? Next slide. So again, I just kind of want to come back to audience discovery. I want to have folks who are identify primarily as scholars of discovery re-raise your hands. And then this is not an exclusive exercise, so now if you identify as a scholar of application, raise your hand. Integration? Oh, opposite, anyway. Teaching? Engagement? Very cool, okay. Thank you so much, Julia. So I really want to pause for just a moment and to articulate a tension that I certainly see as an institutional change scholar, and that I suspect that many of you might experience as folks who either have an engagement practice, do some type of engaged work, are interested in translating your work into real-world impact, which is that the vast majority of public research universities tend to preference the scholarship of discovery. Yeah? I would argue that the scholarship of application, especially for land-grant universities that have a cooperative extension mission, can also be elevated. Teaching I'm going to put in its own special category because it's one of the 3 areas of the canonical research university that are explicitly called out. But what I would say and what I would suggest is that the scholarship of integration and the scholarship of application, on the whole, if we look at a system-wide, don't get enough emphasis. And this is really challenging because the corollary that I'm going to argue today is that when you're talking about the translation of research into practice, when you're talking about real-world impact, the scholarship of application and the scholarship of integration is where it's at. Okay, next slide. So today, what I'm going to focus on is highlighting a few different types of examples, both from the scholars that I've supported as well as researchers, research that I've conducted myself, that really follow 3 different types of pathways that are broadly grouped into the scholarship of application and the scholarship of integration. I really don't know what's going on here, so I really appreciate everyone's patience. And collectively, these are the 3 approaches that gave rise to the title of my talk. And so the invitation that I would make to all of you in the audience, especially you trainees, is to think about what feels like it might resonate with you. I'll also say that while I've identified these 3 pathways, these are not the only 3 pathways. These are just the ones that I'm going to sort of categorically name for the purposes of today's talk, okay? All right, so let's dive in. Let's talk about engagement praxis. Thank you. Also, Julia, you're doing an amazing job anticipating when I would want to switch slides, so I appreciate that. So let's talk about engagement praxis. So what I mean by engagement praxis is folks who have a scholarly set of a set of scholarly ambitions and a set of engagement ambitions, right? That they might view connections between these things, but that in general, their scholarship is scholarly and their engagement translates that scholarship. So let me give you an example. Monica Deuce is a really fantastic scholar at the University of Michigan. She's a neuroscientist. She studies sugar in the brain and the impacts of repeated sugar exposure in the way that that translates into both neuroplasticity, in other words, how your brain changes as a result of repeated sugar exposure, and then how that impacts behavior around sugar consumption. So in other words, if you drink an awful lot of Coke, you're gonna wanna continue to drink an awful lot of Coke. It becomes a positive feedback loop, right? So Monica studies how this happens. Monica's research is primarily based in genetics and molecular biology. And so her lab is primarily focused on the mechanics of this work. She uses things like Drosophila as models, and so she does a lot of fly experiments. She uses different types of genetic tools, including genetic manipulations to increase or decrease expressions of specific genes in order to understand the influence of those genes on sugar consumption behavior. You get the idea, right? That is the focus of her scholarship. In addition to this work, Monica has been extraordinarily active in translating her work into meaningful ways for different types of groups and constituencies who it might impact. So one really good example of this is that she co-developed an exhibit at the U of M Museum of Natural History about sugar in the brain and developed a comic book that was circulated as part of the exhibit for youth and families to interact with, to try and think through how the lessons of the exhibit applied in their own lives and related to their own sugar consumption, right? In addition, she happens to just be a general all-around superstar. She's currently serving as a White House Policy Fellow and a special advisor to the Secretary of the Navy. So by highlighting this communication-related example, I'm only actually touching a very small part of her engagement praxis, okay? But this is what I mean about Avenue 1. You've got your scholarship, you've got your engagement, and the trick for pursuing a translation of research and impact here is to identify the connection points between the two. Make sense? All right, number 2. Second example, co-creation. What I mean by co-creation is actually involving different public groups and constituencies in the research itself, right? This should hopefully be really familiar. And so the example that I'll highlight here is a scholar in the School of Nursing named Sarah Peitzmeier. Now, Sarah is an interesting human. She works with trans and non-binary youth and is really interested in helping to support youth and their families in making healthy decisions around transitioning. And so most recently, she partnered with a coalition of doctors and patient advocacy organizations, as well as like locally organized family groups for non-binary and trans youth to do a co-created research project. She was interested in working with youth to understand their preferences around chest binding during transition and to help integrate medical perspectives to ensure that that chest binding was healthy, that it didn't put too much pressure on the rib cage, for example, right? And so she worked with these community groups to co-create the questions and to frame them in meaningful ways, then also engaged with both those groups and the sort of meta-networks, the groups connected to those groups, to actually do focus groups, interviews, those types of more qualitative research connections, or research analyses, in order to draw out both current practices and then to integrate that with her knowledge of health and childhood development as a nurse, okay? So you've got co-creation. But then she leveled it up. Next slide. She then co-created a graphic novel with comic book artist Maya Kobabe. And if Maya's name is familiar, it's because she's the author of Genderqueer, which is one of the really important works that's unfortunately getting targeted and removed from libraries for those who are scared of what it has to say. I'd highlight here that the graphic novel is explicitly a very co-equal partnership between Maya and Sarah. And so it wasn't just that she took the approach of co-creating the research questions, the research process, the research results with people in the community that she was working with, But she also worked with Maya to try and identify the themes that would go into the book. In other words, she and Maya worked together to translate what they found from those interviews and focus groups and the academic papers into the types of messages and stories that would get highlighted. They co-created the characters in Breathe, and they co-created the ways that those characters would be represented. And so they both contributed different types of expertise, but it was a really reciprocal, mutually beneficial process, okay? So this is what I mean about co-creation, and a really, hopefully, detailed example of co-creation. I'll also highlight that it's okay, you can just leave it, yeah. I'll also highlight that I chose those two types of examples of outreach to be communication-focused examples, mostly because of this audience. But please, please know that I can pull a million different types of examples that don't have to do with graphic novels or comic books out of my pocket too, okay? So those are two examples of what I would describe as the scholarship of application, right? The active translation of research that might be a little bit more foundational or might be situated in a scholarly space into forms of public impact, and then the actual involvement of public groups and communities as co-equal experts in their own right, with different ways of knowing, with different bases of experiences, and with different sets of expertise that becomes complementary to a research process, okay? So now we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about what I consider to be the most neglected child of Boyer's scholarships, which is the scholarship of integration. And admittedly, I'm biased here because I consider myself to be a scholar of integration. So 3 examples of what I mean by this. This is the third pathway, sense-making. So the first one, and actually, can you go back for a second, Julia? Thank you. So the first thing that I'll say when it comes to the scholarship of integration is that the first step for any of these processes, for any of these sense-making research-based processes, is to identify a challenge. And the key thing about the identification of that challenge is that it has to be from a practitioner lens. And so when I'm thinking about engaging in this type of research, what I'm first looking for is a problem. That's something that is not working. So this frequently involves engaging with my campus communities and trying to understand, like, what's the sticking point that campus community just can't get past. It frequently means that, like, I've done my own research to try and understand, like, where there are research gaps, and, like, if there are questions that can be addressed by pulling in different types of influences, different disciplinary, different types of literature from different disciplines, different types of practitioner resources. So it involves a lot of being open-hearted and listening and really just watching very carefully. And so as I frame each of these examples, you'll see that I frame them around a challenge, and that's deliberate. And I would argue that the scholarship of integration needs to be framed around challenges that are real world in order to be applied, okay? Thank you. Okay, so the first challenge. The challenge was back in the, early 2010s, 2013, 2014, that practitioners who are interested in science communication, there's this huge, big rising tide of folks who are interested in science communication, but there was no competency framework to articulate what that meant, right? There were as many different approaches to training science communication and even articulating what science communication was as there were people teaching it. And as someone who was a part of the grad SciComm movement, that was really frustrating for me, right? It was really frustrating for me. And so in this case, I was actually identifying as a practitioner because this challenge affected me. I wanted, as a graduate student, to know what it was that I needed to learn. And there wasn't any singular resource that helped me figure out what that was. So some colleagues, including those listed on the screen, as well as a handful of my collaborators who gave rise to that same grad SciComm organization, and I worked really carefully at the time to try and pull as much as what we could from the literature to understand how to group different types of competencies. And eventually what we ended up doing is synthesizing that into this framework that was published, I don't even remember how long ago. So that's what I mean by the idea of articulating a core challenge and then doing scholarship of sense-making. Now, there were a lot of issues with this, this particular framework, and so like I had a little bit of mixed feelings about highlighting this as opposed to one of my other projects. And also highlight that Ayelet Barham-Sabari and Bruce Lichtenstein have really carried this ball much, much further in a much more thoughtful way than my colleagues and I did initially. And so I presented this mostly as to try and say that you can take a swing at this and recognize that other people are swinging in valuable and important ways, and I'd actually point to their work as a better exemplar of competency frameworks for this space at this point. Okay? Next example. The next challenge was that when my colleagues and I were starting our presidential focus area initiatives at the University of Michigan, we kept having conversations with scholars across disciplines who were all using different words to describe related concepts, right? Seeing some nods from folks in the audience. So up on the screen, I've listed a whole set of words that I broadly associate to be connected with public engagement and the societal impact of research. Many of these have disciplinary foci. Many of these come from specific geographical domains. So for instance, knowledge diffusion, knowledge mobilization are frequently used in Canada and the UK and parts of Europe, right? But fundamentally, a lot of what this is talking about, all of this language, is talking about the same idea. So why do we have so much variation? Why do we have so much variation? Well, I would argue, it's because the umbrella terms that these ideas are trying to capture are insufficiently specific to be meaningful. That it's hard for practitioners and researchers to understand their relationship to one another when you're talking with an umbrella term. So that's the core challenge in this particular case. Next slide. So my team and I tried to take this on. Okay, so we took it on in a couple of different ways. Again, we started with what was known in the literature. We tried to look at the different groups and scholarly communities to understand how they were self-describing, as well as looking at practitioners and how practitioners themselves were self-describing. So for example, folks who are media scholars would describe themselves as media scholars, and that's not necessarily the same way that journalists would self-describe, right? Similarly, folks who are interested in museum work would probably describe themselves as being associated with alternative, informal, maybe free choice learning environments, right? And so the core goal was to try and zero in on the types of languages that people who are actually doing the work were using to self-describe, and use that as a window to get beyond the big arching umbrella and into something a little bit more specific and a little bit more useful that could then span disciplines. And so what emerged, and then we had this whole process aside from that, where in addition to the literature framing, like we came up with a first draft of our framework, we did a big participatory engagement process that I would describe as research adjacent, but not necessarily research, focus group like, but not necessarily IRB overseen, that we used to pressure test that framework and get progressively, hopefully better and better and better. And so what emerged, thank you, Julia, is what we call the 12 domains of public engagement. And if anyone is interested in this, I am more than happy to send you a 2-pager about it, as well as other forums. And so what we argue is that this is a way of describing different contexts, different groups, different constituencies, and different ways and strategies of engaging that was derived from the people who are doing the work, okay? This is different, it's complementary to other ways of describing engagement. So who here is familiar with the International Association of Public Participation, spectrum of public participation? A couple people, yeah? So if you're not familiar with it, IAP2 is basically saying there are different ways and different ways to partner and different levels of partnership. Everything from a partnership that just involves the flow of information to the type of partnership that involves the transition of power so that the partner is making the decision as opposed to usually the institution, okay? And so that's a different way of understanding this. I'll also highlight that this is a different way of understanding this than the values basis that a lot of folks who are engaged practitioners talk about, right? When I think about the how of public engagement, the words like reciprocity and mutual benefit and community basis of expertise, things along those lines, that's complementary to what I'm talking about here. This is trying to describe communities as opposed to necessarily relationship dynamics, okay? Third example. Here the challenge here the challenge was that we were trying to really get at the idea of institutional change. So Dominique referenced that I spent 2 years as a fellow with the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. And here, this is really trying to anchor in the idea that institutions maybe don't currently broadly value engaged in equity-oriented work, but that they could. And that this is another one of those places where folks who are interested in institutional change needed guidance in order to understand where to start. Okay? And that guidance can take the form of a few different types of things. It might look like a menu of different types of interventions. It might look like successful change stories. You get the idea. But the point was to try and provide some of that guidance such that if institutional change leaders wanted to start an initiative, that they had some place to start, that they didn't have to do the sense-making work themselves. So that's what this project was about. And so again, the process was starting with the literature and developing, I'd say, a pretty comprehensive database of different types of strategic tactics, actions, and strategies that relate to institutional change to try and create institutions of higher education that are more welcoming and supportive for engaged scholars. In addition to that, I also highlighted 10 institutions, several of which were really deep process change studies, really looking at the how and why of institutional change on individual campuses, and then really extracting out and providing lessons learned. And so what resulted was this report, which is genuinely intended as an action framework for institutional change leaders to take to evaluate their individual institutional context, because no two campuses are the same. We all are dealing with different things, and the same set of interventions that might apply at Michigan will probably not apply here at Wisconsin. And then think about what might be applicable. Next slide. So just to dive in, because many of you, I've at least heard that many of you are interested in this. These are the 8 areas of strategic change that emerged. Number 1, helping to support institutional leaders, folks like chief engagement officers who are empowered and can take on the work of institutional change from a position of authority and resourcing. Number 2, usually the trumpeting elephant in the room, tenure, promotion, retention. Number 3, investing in institutional infrastructures. So this might be the type of infrastructure that my good colleague over here is driving. Number 3, establishing reporting structures. In other words, using data to try and reinforce change efforts. Number 5, maintaining catalytic funding programs to make sure that internal work is signaling the value of especially engaged in equity-oriented efforts. Building capacity. This is pretty straightforward, hopefully. Especially both informal capacity building and formal capacity building for curricular-based and co-curricular-based. And finally, rewarding programs to try and reinforce the idea of importance through culture. In order to translate this into practice, though, it was insufficient to publish a report. And so one of the things that my team did, in part because we were engaging with folks like me to understand what the needs of the practitioners were in institutional change contexts, is basically created a parallel resource that dove really, really deep into each of the different types of actions that gave rise to those 8 clusters. And that's this database that you can sort by lots of different types of information, including implementation level and like where on campus it might be appropriate to implement a specific type of intervention. And we released this as a parallel to the report. And then, like I said before, we also did a lot of really, really in-depth case studies, one of my home institution, one of the University of Arizona, and then we also did higher level like example case studies of individual programs that corresponded to each of the 8 areas of strategic action at other universities, including Morgan State, including UNCG, including the University of Missouri system, among others. Great. So I want to take a beat here. Just outlined what I hope is a reasonably clear pathway, or 3 different reasonably clear pathways that I would argue will help get you from being a researcher to having real-world impact. Are there any questions or comments before I move on? Because I have a couple more comments before I open the floor entirely.
Just finish because then we stop the recording.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you, Dominique. And next. So one of the last things that I want to say is that all of these different pathways require skill. So in other words, most of the types of things that I'm talking about here are going to be opportunities that you're going to need to build skill and knowledge in order to be able to do effectively. And I hate to say it, most of the time the opportunities to build those skills aren't necessarily situated in a graduate program. There's a good news, there's a flip side to that. It requires courage, because as we talked about before, there is this tension in modern higher education that preferences, I would argue, the scholarship of discovery and doesn't necessarily preference the scholarship of application or integration to the degree that I would like to see it. And it also requires commitment, because I hate to say it, but for those of you who are in research practice partnerships or engaged research relationships, it takes a lot of time, yeah? It takes a lot of time. And it takes a lot more time than doing techniques that are more traditionally purely academic. Relationships move at the speed of trust, and especially when you're working with communities that have been actively harmed by academic partners in the past or who have experienced other forms of systemic oppression or injustice, it takes a lot of time to build trust with those communities. And it's important to do that the right way. And so again, these things take a lot of thought, a lot of preparation. So up here, I've just listed a few of the types of skills that are not traditionally taught in graduate school that I find particularly helpful with each of these different pathways to impact. And this is by no means exhaustive, by no means exhaustive. This is just based on my experience, some of the places that I think are valuable to really spend some focused effort if you're interested in pursuing one of these pathways to practice. I'll also highlight that I don't know the University of Michigan or the University of Wisconsin landscape the way that I know the University of Michigan landscape. But the good news is, the sharper side, or the other side of that sharp blade, is that Wisconsin has resources to help you learn these things. So for example, if you're interested in co-creation, these are two on-campus resources that can help provide training, potentially connect you with community partners. Certainly, I'm sorry. Thank you. The Mordridge Institute of Research is another one, right? So the point here is not to say to be discouraged, but rather to say be ambitious and just figure out if you are looking for opportunities to develop these skills, go to where there are opportunities that are offered. And
Also Department of Life Science Communication.
yes. I'm not trying to say that you won't learn things in your department. You absolutely will, especially for this department. I'm just saying I think it is beneficial for you trainees in the room to think expansively, including your department and beyond it. Thank you. Okay. The last thing that I'll say is that this tension that I've acknowledged over the course of the last 40 minutes or so is one that I'm certainly not alone in acknowledging, and that there are a lot of players who are actively discussing this. There's a series of workshops hosted by the National Academies of Science and Medicine that are around the changing landscape of higher education and incentive structures in higher education. There are networks of funders, including those led by the Rita Allen Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trusts, the W2 Grant Foundation, Kavli. You get the idea. There are a lot of folks who are really interested in doing this. And that's even before we get to institutional change movements that are coordinated on individual campuses or by associations of organizations of higher education. Right? And so if you are interested in institutional change and helping to shift this culture, just please know that there is a broader conversation that you can join, and if you're interested in going down that rabbit hole, I'm happy to lead you. So now that's what I had planned for today. I'm happy to talk, address questions, comments. I'd love to hear reflections. But in general, if you are interested in learning more about what my team actually does on a nuts and bolts basis, because I didn't talk a ton about that today, that's our website and our email address and my personal email address. So.